Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. We're here with Dr. Sanjay Manchanda from Tucson, Arizona, who's an integrative counseling practitioner, neurofeedback practitioner, meditator, and we're going to be talking a lot about stress, meditation, Q analysis, neurofeedback in today's call. Welcome, Dr. Manchanda, to the call.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nice to be here.
Give us some background for listeners that don't know you and how you got to where you are right now and the work that you're doing and your also personal interests. Because it sounds like we're going to be talking a little bit of both, right? We're going to be talking about your professional work, and there is a crossover into your personal work and how we met at the Transformative Tech Conference. So introduce us to yourself, please.
Sure. I grew up in India, and I was always very interested in science and also very interested in spirituality. But I really followed the path of science a lot when I was actually in India. And then I came over to the US to study further and did my bachelor's in electrical engineering and my master's and PhD in computer science. And I got a bit disillusioned because in the back of my mind, I sort of strayed. I was really looking more at the question of suffering in a deeper, my heart was wanting to deal with the question of suffering, what life is really about. And I was no longer doing that. I was doing stuff I enjoyed, and more importantly, on top of that, I had been anxious since I was pretty young. So my anxiety level only increased over time. And then I was pretty depressed as well. After I finished my PhD and I realized, I was a professor here at the University of Arizona. And I thought, well, this was my life. And something was off for me about that. And I also really needed to deal with my anxiety and depression, which were getting worse. So that's when I really started doing yoga and meditating.
Wow.
Out here.
And so your professorship was in a different field?
Yeah, computer science.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the more I did that, the more I got into it. And I started also with Vipassana with Shinzen Yang, who takes a kind of a scientific approach to the field of meditation, and which was very appealing to me initially. And as I did more of that, I realized that that's what I needed to follow for a while, and I quit my job as a professor. And as soon as I did that, a lot of things opened up for me. I immediately discovered I had a talent for working with people. I met this fellow called Arnold Mindell. He's the founder of process-oriented psychology, and I loved his playful approach to working with the psyche. And also realized that, I really wanted to work on the right side of my brain, you could say, the emotional side, the intuitive side, the feeling side. And so I just followed that for a while. I did some consulting, and I did a lot of training. I became an energy healer. I studied counseling and psychotherapy and body work. And then over time, I started to teach meditation and then got a degree in counseling and started working with people. And that's what I've been doing for almost 25 years since this happened.
Oh, I love that. So why don't we start with talking about this right brain reference that you made and split brain theory, as I think that it's called, correct?
Yes, right.
Define that for us.
Well, it's really a very loose way of talking. In general, if you look at the brain, it seems the left brain has more of the symbolic processing functions, but it also depends on which part of the brain you're talking about. So the front or the back. But just in general, the left brain is more symbolic. It's the one that tells stories and works with symbols. And the right brain is more connected to the immediate experience of the moment and to receiving input from the surroundings. So if something happens in your environment, for example, the initial pickup it's the part of the brain that's looking out for what's happening in the environment. Let me put it that way.
In a fight or flight way, in a
No,
just
no, it is just you could be in a fight or flight if your system is highly vigilant, but no, but it's called you could call it basic alerting or vigilance. It's called alerting technically in attention circuitry, and so it's alert in the background outside your conscious. You don't have to control that consciously. It's just your system is alert to sense what's going on around you, and it's mostly done by circuitry that's right lateralized and connected to the parasympathetic nervous system.
interesting.
So it's actually normally in a healthy way, it's relaxed but alert. And that's really what you're training in meditations like Zen and Vipassana, where the focus is on really calming the system. You're activating, like breath meditation, you're calming the system, but you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, because the ideal state would not be so calm that you're asleep and non-vigilant and non-alert. It's alert and relaxed, which is like a degree of parasympathetic activation.
Got it.
So your rest and digest system is active in a way, although it's the one that also keeps your body in non-fight or flight mode. That's the ideal state.
Well,
Right.
one of the reasons I was really attracted to you is your scientific approach to meditation and deep states. Can you give us a definition of meditation?
Well, this is always a question, right? So, in general, what we say is meditation is some way of affecting your ability to pay attention. So it's any techniques that generally involve controlling your attention, learning to control your attention in some way. But really, after that, it depends on, there's different kinds of meditation. So you can, we say you have focusing meditations, which really focus on one object or one pointedness. There's open monitoring meditations where your focus is not on one thing, but sort of everything at once. You have loving kindness kinds of meditations, positive state meditations, which are more emotional in nature, creating positive states. So there's at least three kinds.
And these are classical, sort of traditional approaches. Is that correct?
Yes.
Like something you would find in the Buddhist tradition or a yogic tradition or a Zen tradition.
Absolutely. All these three kinds are practiced. Yeah. You would practice, say, focusing on the breath. You might practice just focusing on whatever comes into awareness in a just sitting format. That would be open monitoring, or you would practice a loving kindness meditation.
And
then you
loving
also
kindness,
have visualization kinds of meditations that involve different components.
so you could say this one pointed meditation on breath is Vipassana. This is the beginnings, anyways, of Vipassana, concentration training leading to body scan.
Right. Yeah.
And open monitoring, where would one find that in the classical texts or in the traditional lineages? What's an example of that?
For example, just sitting practice in Soto Zen.
Okay.
But it's used everywhere. It's used in Vajrayana as well as Theravada traditions. Depends on the style that you're practicing. But the idea there is you just sit, and instead of focusing on one particular aspect of your experience, you're just letting whatever come in and go. So you're just noticing. For example, if you do a noting kind of meditation, you will be noting, for example, hearing, feeling, seeing, wherever your attention goes, you're just noting it in a noting kind of meditation. Yeah,
well, one of the things that's so interesting to me is that these ways of attending or training your attention,
right,
they all developed. Many of them developed independently in different eras in different
right,
parts of the world. Nowadays, with our exploration into this world of meditation, we have a multitude of styles at our fingertips when someone enters this practice. And you also have so many doctors telling people, you are way stressed out, you need to go meditate. And what happens is people get put, like a doctor, if they're not meditating, have no real script for that other than just go meditate, with no specific dosage, no specific brand. And how does one then connect these two dots? They're unhappy and they're looking for a sense of change, whatever that change might be. How do they then find the right type of practice to suit their needs? Can we talk about this?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So let me actually introduce that by telling you a story about myself. So how I got into the EEG part of it. So about 15 years ago, I had a client, and I was, as well as a meditation student, and I was teaching him some practices of focusing in the body and then open monitoring kinds of practices, with a particular emphasis on sensing into space, which is also a classical meditation, but not often taught directly. And he really liked that. And then he said to me, he had discovered that there was a biofeedback researcher who was teaching a meditation similar to mine that he had discovered. And I didn't know much about the biofeedback field at that time. So the name of this researcher is Les Femi. He's one of the original grandfathers of biofeedback and neurofeedback. And he was a researcher in Stony Brook working on alpha waves training and detection. And so so I discovered his meditation. I thought, this is really good stuff. He was also a Zen student, and then he discovered how to generate more alpha waves, and that this meditation on space could generate more alpha waves, and he showed that. So I decided to look into the field of neurofeedback and study with him initially. And what I found at that point in my practice was that I was having what is called sinking mind, or I would get so relaxed, it would be slowed down, I would fall asleep. I have a depressive tendency in my life anyway, and at that point the meditation was making me more depressed. So it wasn't actually helping me at that point. It had really helped me up to that point, but something had shifted. And when I started to study neurofeedback, I discovered that there was these different brain waves that we could train up and down. Like alpha waves were connected with relaxation. You could train them up and you'd go into a more relaxed and open state. But you could also train beta waves. And you could train beta waves to get more one-pointed focus and energy. And I realized that that's what I needed. So I took some training, kind of classical, what we call classical ADD training. So people who have attention deficit disorder, they have parts of their attention circuitry running too slow. That's why if you give them speed or Ritalin, they feel better. They actually feel more relaxed and present and focused. So I did this training with some low beta and beta training, and the quality of my meditation improved. My mood improved. I felt much better. So I realized that, this was a great way to start understanding what meditation was doing and how to tailor it to specific individuals.
Now, did that cause you to change your meditation style or adapt your current meditation to your work?
Both. So I decided to take more training in neurofeedback for my clinical and personal interest. In terms of my meditation style, I realized more clearly that I needed more energy in my meditations. I needed to meditate more eyes open, for example, to maintain wakefulness. And of course, this is all in the classical text, but it came from this technical end, and I wasn't getting it classically. Classically, the Buddha points out that there's 7 different factors of enlightenment which need to be generated in your practice, meditation as well as inquiry and other aspects of your practice. And the 7 factors include opposites, like energy versus relaxation, like concentration versus, actually it would be concentration versus relaxation. It would be energy versus equanimity. So it's that you have to balance these different factors.
I had a very similar, almost like kind of polar opposite reaction, because I've been, about 15 years ago, I started Vipassana practice. And the more I did it, the more headaches I got. And my teacher just kept telling me, just keep doing it. Just keep doing it.
Right,
And like,
right.
oh, like, so of course, right? I'd like want to be the best
Right.
student. And then I'm
Right.
like, if I had a hammer, it would have been
Right.
like that, right? Just smashing myself. Well, then I ended up arriving at open focus and less
Right.
Femi.
Right.
And I had this incredible experience. And I had my brain mapped a couple times, and I was having, so I have, hyper arousal tendencies and excessive high beta. And so for me, really focusing on increasing alpha, which I was underpowered in, was exactly the medicine that I need. And so
Exactly.
this one pointed attention, concentration on breath was the worst medicine. In fact, it was poison to me because I knew how to focus, and it was like, oh God, I love this hyper focus, and I can do
Right.
that, and whoa, I'm just driving a nail right into my skull. And I think that's so fascinating. And so, and most people will arrive at headspace or calm as the answer to their meditation. And I wish I had some metrics on to see how effective that was for people, and how, like, what the usage time was before people quit, and how many people continued, and where did that end up taking people, and everything else.
Yeah, exactly. So it really does depend on, and ultimately it depends on who's meditating. That's how you decide the right meditation practice. See, so there's another way to think about it. Like if you're a go-getter, high achiever, highly focused, over-trying, over-efforting, doing kind of person, well, then you need more calm-producing meditations, at least to start with. And so, yeah, that's ultimately that's part, and actually that is part of mindfulness as well, is the balance between calm and inquiry. And inquiry is looking into what is your nature of your experience and yourself, and calm is just producing calm states. And that's another part of the 7 factors of enlightenment. You can think of mindfulness as balancing the 6 other factors. So like joy and equanimity, calmness and inquiry, and energy and concentration. And so one of the ways that, even going beyond just meditation, is that meditation itself will take you to certain places of training your attention, focus, or balance of alertness or relaxation. Then for real spiritual practice, you need to inquire into the nature of the self.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go with you, is most people enter meditation from a pathological state, right? This is the medicine for your whatever, your dysfunction.
Right.
Well, that wasn't the original purpose of meditation. It wasn't like the farmer in the field was like, oh, I'm so stressed out, I need to go meditate.
Right.
It was an entirely different. So let's talk about enlightenment, samadhi, deep states. What can you tell us about this?
Well, this is a big question. There's meditation, and then there's waking up to your true nature. The meditation is supposed to be a preparation to help you to do that. Not that you always need that preparation, but it's extremely helpful, actually. But the act of starting to discover and deepen your discovery of who you are is simply an act of looking within at the nature of yourself, beyond the personality, beyond your ideas of yourself. So what the Buddha discovered, his crucial discovery, was that there is a constant sense of unease, stress, and suffering in our life, and that the basis of it can be considered to be two forms. One is craving and aversion, how we try to attach to pleasant experiences and run away from unpleasant experiences. But in my opinion, even more importantly, the basis of that is false ideas about who we are, what we call in yoga fundamental ignorance as well. It's fundamental ignorance about who we are, that we identify with thoughts, sensations, emotions about who we are, rather than sensing that even any idea about yourself is something that's occurring in the open field of what we might call awareness. And so the crucial principle of waking up to our true nature is stepping outside, in a way, noticing there's already an outside the mind, outside the feeling space of beingness, you could say, just words really, of openness, in which all thoughts, feelings, words occur. And that who we are is not a particle or even a wave, but this empty open field, as to use a physics metaphor.
Right. Like the quantum field or the scalar field.
Right. Just like if you have a magnetic field or electrical field, you see the effects of it, but it itself is invisible. It's only seen through its effects. But it's, it's real in the sense that it has real effects. It produces energy, for example. It can produce energy. So it causes movement. So it's that, and that looking is actually very simple. It's just that our minds are too caught up in the stories of the world and ourselves to make that simple, clear looking and get the insight. So the meditation is a way of balancing our system, our mind and our body, to be in a calm and highly functional, focused space so we can actually look clearly. And that looking then wakes us up to who we are, and that's when the real journey begins in terms of spirituality.
Let's talk a little technical. QEEG is something that I've been exploring. You've been doing this for a long time. Can you introduce the listeners to a Q, some of the metrics that you obtain from doing a Q, the purpose of obtaining a Q?
Yeah, QEEG stands for quantitative EEG recording. And what we'll do is put a number of electrodes in the head and take a recording simultaneously of, say, 19, 24, or 32, or 64, 128 channels. And at the clinical level, we normally been working with 19 channels, which is just about the minimum you can get away with. And these recordings are then filtered to remove artifacts such as caused by eye blinks and other movements and jaw tension, and maybe, hopefully. And then they're filtered, and then you take different statistics or different bands of the QEEG. So there's different frequencies that are found within the brain signal. So you can think of the brain as a symphony of different sounds, of different volumes, from low notes to high notes. And then we can analyze the recording at different points in the brain to see what signals are playing, what frequency or notes are playing, and how strong are they, and how well are they phase linked with each other. In other words, how good is the timing between different parts. So a QEEG allows us to sort of analyze the sounds of the orchestra, the electrical orchestra that the brain's producing, and then also compare it. Usually we have a database of so-called high-functioning normals that we can compare it with and say, okay, well, this part of the brain is too low, for example, in beta, and normal functioning people have a higher beta, and this has been correlated with better focus, for example. It's connected with the focusing part of the brain.
Okay. How is that? Let's say we've got a listener who's been interested in getting into meditation, or has tried and failed at their meditation. How could that analysis be useful?
Yes, so that analysis, along with the appropriate interview to see what's really going on in their life and their practice and their history, so the two combined, they will give us an idea of maybe, what kind of meditation or other strategies to give that person to help them the most. And what the QEEG data does is to give us a whole new window into the functioning of their body and the brain, and to confirm or deny certain results, and to think about what different meditations do in the brain and for people, and what might be appropriate. So, for example, if we find that this person is more depressive and they don't have good focus, then we'll look and see, is there a sign in the brain that we find normally correlates with that. So, for example, the frontal cortex is running too slow. That's often the case. Or it may be some other part of the brain that's relevant to paying attention. And we say, okay, so they need to activate more. They need to have more energy in their practice. So you may give them meditation that involves more focusing or eyes open work or shorter periods of time, but more intensely, things that will give them the energy and focus that they're needing, and the brain waves are helping you to confirm your hypothesis. And similarly, if they're slowing, then if they have too much beta, like you were talking about in yourself, we might say, okay, well, you need a meditation that increases alpha. Here's some possibilities. For example, open focus is a great one for that. As well as now with the new technological abilities, we can help them to speed up their practice by, say, giving them some stimulation of the brain or neurofeedback for the brain. So that's where some of the technologies come in to improve people's performance as well as meditation practice.
I love this. It's been so dramatic for me personally to pair them together. Talk about neurofeedback as a starter.
Right. So in neurofeedback, what we're doing is putting a couple of electrodes on the brain and then reading the EEG signal, analyzing it into different bands, and then make a plan and see we have some idea. We may need to increase the strength or the volume of certain bands or certain notes, or decrease certain bands or certain notes, or change the timing of the way certain circuits link to each other, or even train a whole circuit in the brain. If we have a lot of electrodes to play with, we can train major parts of the brain together. And the idea is to help the person to activate the circuits in their brain that they most need to function better. So whether it's the attention network, the salience network, or just general relaxation, we can give them signals based on how their brain's functioning to show them if they're moving in the right direction or not. In a classical biofeedback training kind of setup. So for example, if you want to help them to be more relaxed and open, if the alpha increases, then you give them a tone that tells them that your alpha is, and the tone volume increases as the alpha increases. Or you play a certain video game and the points are based on how well your brain's doing. And so that allows us to start training the brain with more clarity and feedback to tell us that the brain's moving in the right direction. And the brain's amazing. It just picks it all up. Often I can do feedback and not even really have to tell someone to make an effort other than just have an intention to do well. And then the brain just picks up and does what it needs to do, just like it learns to balance in a non-verbal way. You don't have to tell yourself, no, I need to balance this way.
And this is not a conscious process. This is what you're alluding to. This is very, what's the word you use? Unconscious, subconscious, below level? Yeah,
usually it is. I mean, you can use conscious strategies to support it, but often the main work is not conscious. Just like learning to balance is not a conscious process. It involves the whole body. And basically you have to be present with your whole body and your feeling state and have the intention of doing better at the game you're playing. And that's all that's needed. Mm-hmm.
So to take this work in neurofeedback, once you've created a program based on a cue,
right?
Doing that, being relatively unconscious, so little effort required to do it, and then pairing that with a meditation practice that is about, in some way, it's a willed intent. It's a very intentional. Yeah. It's intention based. It's how do we put this? Least amount of effort with intention, right?
Right.
Is a really good marriage.
Yes. Yeah, I like the way you put it.
So when it comes to neurofeedback, can you give us some examples of in the neurofeedback world classical pairings with meditations? One that I've been looking at, I haven't started yet, is alpha theta.
Right.
Could you talk maybe about that a little bit and some others?
Yeah,
that
well,
are
let's start.
common?
Let's start with the simplest stuff. So what we find for good functioning in the brain in general, for any kind of optimal functioning, including meditation and in life, the brain should be able to do three simple things in terms of neurofeedback. One is if you put an electrode in the frontal cortex, in the central front of the brain, like at the third eye or higher, in the forehead, in that midline on the forehead, there's the what we call the squash, being able to reduce the activity of that area tremendously. So it's to reduce the entire EEG signal. And that corresponds to doing meditations like a flame meditation or some other one-pointed meditation. And that allows you to, because the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex that are connected with what is called executive control, which is selecting your attention and placing it on one thing as opposed to another thing. It's like sorting and selecting. So I'm going to maintain my focus on tasks and not be, even though there's another stimulus, I'm going to ignore that stimulus and come back to the task. And that's done by that's one of the things done by the prefrontal cortex. So that builds that strength. So one-pointed meditations build that strength, and one of the EEG connections to that is just being able to squash the whole EEG signal across all the bands. And so that's one thing. Another simple thing in the center of the head, so if you go right to the vertex of the head in the center midline, there you have the sensory motor cortex. And there being able to squash theta and increase the amplitude or the volume of low beta, certain band of frequency, is connected with maintaining stillness, a still focus that balances inside and outside. Okay, so that's what the low beta is. So when a cat, the classical example is a cat that's looking at a mouse with great interest but not moving, perfectly still.
Ooh, okay? I love that.
So that perfectly poised state of stillness is usually connected with a reduction in theta in that moment and an increase in low beta, which low beta waves are run at a high amplitude in the sensory motor cortex when the sensory motor cortex is in this still alert state. So being able to do that is a useful skill. And then if you move along the midline to the back to the parietal cortex, then there you're connecting to the thalamus in the brain, where in the thalamocortical rhythm, which is sort of like a timing circuit for the whole brain. And there you get to, that's where the alpha waves are the highest in any normal functioning brain. And when you close your eyes, alpha goes up even more because the visual cortex is not being stimulated, and alpha is like the idle frequency of the brain, and you want a healthy alpha rhythm. So you start doing alpha training, especially eyes closed, you start to get deeper states of relaxation, openness, and get into more parasympathetic arousal, which is really connecting to more classical understanding of meditation is relaxation. So you should be able to do that. So that's at least three things. I mean, there's a lot more, but I'm getting...
I'm so glad we're talking. I'm so glad. So
no, I can also tell you more about, the more current research in that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So one of the things that's been happening in the last 5 years, 7 years so is there's been a lot more research in meditation and EEG and fMRI. And so I can give you some more examples. So Judson Brewer is a psychiatrist researcher who looked at different styles of meditation practice and tried to see what was common. And what he found was that he said, well, one of the common things is no matter what meditation you're practicing, you're more in the moment and the mind is wandering less. Your mind's not wandering so much. And especially if you're more experienced, your mind wanders less than if you're less experienced as a meditator, no matter what your meditation you're doing. Now, so it turns out that the mind wandering circuit are different parts of the brain that are actually highly active when the mind is wandering. It's particularly have to do with the midline and the anterior cingulate cortex or the prefrontal cortex in the front middle of the head, and the posterior cingulate cortex, which is in the center of the back of the head, and a couple other areas, but these two are major hubs. And what scientists found is that when people are not on task, let's say they're not solving an arithmetic problem or a particular focusing task, then the brain is actually consuming more glucose at so-called rest than when it is doing a task, which they found surprising. Now, as a meditator, we may not find it surprising, because when you start to meditate, you notice how active the mind is and not staying on task. And that's what they discovered. They call it the default mode network. It's sort of what is the mind doing in default if it's not doing a task. And this is the parts of the network of the brain that are active when the mind is wandering, and is typically involved in self-oriented thinking of some sort. So it's thinking about the self. It's like making a future plan, visualizing yourself doing something, or having a great success, or just thinking about what someone said to you and how you feel about it, or what happened in the past, what you might do in the future, or where you're located in space, which involves thinking about a self, like creating a virtual self in your mind, and different ways that the self can get triggered.
When you say in space, do you mean physically in space? Do you? Yeah. Okay.
Right, like you close your eyes,
proprioceptive quality.
Yeah, close your eyes, think about yourself in the room. You have an image, a vague image of yourself in a room. Okay, that's what I mean. That's a type of self-thinking. All these different types. How am I doing in this meditation? I'm doing well. That's a self-talk. Okay, and all of that involves the default mode circuit being activated in one form or another, different aspects of it. Okay, there's more detail one can go into, but not necessary for this conversation about that. But the default mode network is active in all these different mind wandering ways, and they typically involve some self-oriented thinking. And so what he found was that in experienced meditators, this circuit is less active in general. Even if you're not meditating, it's just less active because of the practice they've been doing. And however, it's more coupled. There's more connections between different parts of this circuit, the middle, front, and back, and the front sides, which have to do with self-monitoring and cognitive control. That those parts are somehow more linked to each other. They can talk to each other better. And also, when you're in a deeply meditative state in which the mind is very quiet, the circuit is very quiet, quieter than, say, someone who's learning to meditate. So based on that idea, he has developed training which picks up the signal from the whole brain, especially in these parts of the brain, and gives people feedback that, okay, now you're in a quieter space.
Wow.
And can be very, very powerful and effective. And in this case, he discovered that a signal which has to do with gamma waves, which are at 64 cycles a second, and actually anywhere from 40 to 100, and a certain band of gamma waves which activate as soon as this circuit activates. It's almost like before the person even knows they're going to have a thought about themselves, he can see the circuit. He can see it activate above baseline and tell them, oh, wait, you're about to think something about yourself. And so you can see that would have a great value in terms of just learning and deepening a meditation practice. And he has shown that indeed it does that. And so I believe he's working on a commercial system to do that as well. But that's just an example of where this research is going.
That's incredible. I'm glad you brought up gamma. It's something I wanted to talk to you about. We spoke to Dr. Juan Acosta Ukiri.
Yes.
That you're familiar with?
Yes.
And he was on the program a couple months ago talking a lot about gamma because of its relationship to Kundalini, its relationship to DMT. But we didn't talk about it really in a meditative context. And I wonder if can you get into that?
Yes. So in my experience in working with these different bands, one simple aspect of way to think about it is arousal. The higher the frequency, the more you activate the higher frequency, the more arousal in the system. Okay, so it's like if you go in beta, you have higher energy in your system. If you go to gamma, you have even higher energy in your system. And gamma is implicated also in higher cognitive functioning, in higher positive states. For example, Richie Davidson has shown that people doing loving kindness meditation and generally more experienced meditators can produce more gamma in the whole brain, synchronized gamma in the whole brain. Particularly when they're doing loving kindness, they have more gamma in the left prefrontal cortex. And here's what's interesting. So on the one hand, Judson Brewer is saying that we are going to show you to have you produce less gamma in this deeply relaxed meditative state. On the other hand, gamma is also associated with positive meditation states. So what gives? Well, it turns out, and gamma is actually critical for higher cognitive functioning, and synchronization of gamma has been shown to be important for memory retrieval, for example, connecting the frontal cortex to the temporal cortex. So it turns out that certain meditations like standard vipassana and meditations produce a deeper, quieter state of parasympathetic, alert, but relaxed activation, which typically would have less gamma in them. But there's other meditations like Kundalini meditations, visualization, Tibetan visualizations, or even meditations connected with being more awake to your true nature, like Dzogchen or self-inquiry. They're actually connected with higher sympathetic activation, more energy, and more gamma. So it depends on what you're doing. Now, any classical path that's complete includes both kinds of meditations and practices. And the way I think about it is that you need to have both. In fact, you need to have a base of alpha and theta, the lower frequencies, this deep relaxed energy states, lower energy but actively alert still states, to actually do the gamma. Typically you do the relaxation exercises first. And in fact, in the brain, gamma actually rides on alpha and theta. It's called cross-frequency coupling, because gamma can propagate across the brain by itself. It's too high energy. So it actually, like radio waves ride on these long waves. Radio programs are high frequency waves that ride on the long waves. So they take a ride on these low energy long waves. So you need one to support the other. So you can have sympathetic activation, which is actually involved with higher cognitive performance, but without going into a stress response. So what you're looking for is this sort of balance of alpha, theta, gamma, which gives you the most optimal functioning possible.
Amazing. I love that. So let's talk about sync, because it's an aspect that people who are not in the neurofeedback field are a little less familiar with. I think people generally are familiar with frequency bands, right? The delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. And there's the amplitude associated with those frequencies increasing as the energy increases. But the sync component, this idea of coherence or asynchrony, can you talk about these terms and what they mean?
Yeah, so we say that two signals are synchronous if they rise and fall together. So it's sort of like, when two signals are synchronous, they'll add up. So it's like, if two people are pushing the swing and they time it so that they push at the same time in the same rhythm, then the swing is going to go higher. If they're pushing kind of in opposite ways, then the swing is going to go lower. So synchrony has to do with the timing of signals, how well they correlate with rising and falling together. And go ahead.
What's not clear to me is synchrony the same as coherence?
No, synchrony is more specific than coherence. Coherence is any relationship between two signals that's consistent. So for example, if one signal increases and the other decreases simultaneously, and they maintain this timing relationship they maintain this relationship over time, then they are coherent because you can predict one from the other in some way. Okay, but they're not synchronous because they're doing opposite things. So in synchrony, they have to be rising together.
In phase.
And falling together. In phase and falling together.
Excellent. How long does it take someone, if you can give us this time measure, how long can you create change in the brain? How long does it take for someone practicing a neurofeedback program on its own, a meditation program on its own, the two coupled together, if you were to quantify that with a Q?
Meaning how many sessions?
Yeah,
how many hours?
how many hours over what course of time, how many months, if you can say that. What?
Oh yeah, it's just completely individual. I mean, typically I would say anywhere from 10 hours to 100 hours. It just depends on so many different factors, the degree of dysfunction, how well you've focused on where the real source of the problem is. Because even as a clinician or a meditation trainer, you might be training some part of the brain which is not really where the cause is. It just is like even a symptom. For example, one part of the brain may run too fast because it's compensating actually for another part of the brain. And if you don't treat the right part, you're just treating the compensation. So there's these complications. So it depends on how well focused your program is, how much dysfunction there is, and how functional the person already is. People come to me and say we can expect anywhere from 10 hours to 100 hours, depending on what's really happening.
And so you also teach the meditation along with the neurofeedback?
Yes, typically I do. But not everybody's interested in that, so I don't do that with everyone. Yeah. But if you are practicing, of course, it's going to reduce your time dramatically. Yeah.
What is the most interesting thing to you that's occurring in this synergy of neurofeedback and meditation right now?
Well, what I'm most excited about is just having more understanding of meditation because of the way we understand the different brain waves, like I told you about arousal and relaxation meditations. All of this is helping to clarify this ancient field where, it's taken a lot. There's not a lot of people who understand these, a lot of great teachers who understands how to teach people to individualize meditations, and our knowledge is increasing, so we can actually have more benefit. And then the technologies for supporting people to move forward faster. And at the moment, I'm interested. What I've been doing really, for lack of better knowledge, is learning to train different parts of the brain in different bands, sort of creating a tune-up effect. So let's see if you can produce more alpha, more delta, more theta, more gamma. Let's see if you can produce theta and gamma together, because that's so critical for functioning. Let's connect up the front and the back and produce theta and gamma in synchrony. And what that does is to open the person and the brain up to new possibilities, and then they find that they make more progress in their meditation practices. They function better. One interesting thing we haven't mentioned is doing microstate training, which is completely new. It turns out that a microstate is certain pattern of EEG activation across the brain, which is stable for some microseconds and then shifts to another one and is involved in some particular functioning of the brain. And you can actually consider training these microstates, which is really training the whole brain at once and training a spectrum of activity across the brain and saying, oh, this is a particular aspect that we should be able to do, and let's see what happens if we do that. For example, we found that schizophrenics have less of certain microstates. What if we train more of that, help them to maintain that? but we're more interested in meditation is what happens to microstates in meditation, and can we give feedback on this whole brain effect? And I mean, trying to do that, we don't quite have the full tools yet, but I've been training different sites. It turns out there's only a few sites in the brain that are involved in default state microstates, and we can train those sites and actually produce very deep states of consciousness. So that's my current interest.
Oh, it's fascinating. Last question before we get off here. It doesn't need to be a long answer, but I wonder if you can just touch for a bit on the motor cortex, since this is intimately involved with asana and movement, and this sensory motor rhythm being
Right.
is as I understand it, kind of optimal, right? This is the optimal. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I can just repeat partly what I said is that that it's been discovered that the sensory motor rhythm typically has a higher amplitude in states of stillness, and the attention is more balanced between the inside of the body and the outside of the body. So it turns out that if you go lower in the frequency, like with alpha and theta, your attention gets more and more internal. And if you go higher in frequency, low beta, beta, and your attention goes more external and outside the body. In gamma, it's more transcending the body. So, and similarly with level of activity, the level of activity and energy drops as you go lower in frequency, and more activation happens as you go higher in frequency. So low beta is kind of an optimal point between low, high activity and internal outside attention. So for that, so you can think of in asana, you have periods of some activity, but when you're holding, that's a state of balance. You want to maintain external, internal attention. You want to maintain activity and stillness together. So low beta training can be important. Typically, I would expect that people in a balanced asana pose will be showing higher low beta activity in the brain at that point. Mm-hmm.
Well, tell the listeners how they can learn more about you.
That's a good question. So far, I have successfully stayed off the radar.
Oh, okay. All right. So,
I let people find me. Okay. I don't even have a website, but that may change this year. So,
well, thank you, sir, for your time.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.